The first crack appeared along the infinity pool deck at 7:12 a.m. on a Monday morning. By noon, it had widened enough for a county inspector to slide the edge of a ruler right into it. And by sunset, one section of the lower concrete retaining face had shifted almost 2 inches directly toward the valley. The pool was closed immediately, the water level dropped, and the terrace completely barricaded, leaving every single homeowner in Ridgecrest Heights desperately wanting to know exactly how a $6 million recreation complex could start falling down the mountain less than 3 years after construction. I knew exactly where the answer began, because 3 weeks earlier, the Homeowners Association had legally forced me to dismantle an old stone wall on my private land just below their pristine pool. They called it an aesthetic violation, but I called it what it had always been, a structural retaining wall. My name is Ethan Mercer, a 54-year-old man who owned 9 acres on the lower side of a heavily steep mountain slope just outside Asheville, North Carolina. My house and orchard had been sitting there long before Ridgecrest Heights was ever developed, and so had the wall, a thick, unpolished fieldstone structure, nearly 6 feet high in places, built deeply into the slope by the previous owner decades earlier. It curved along the lower hillside like a gray spine, rough, uneven, highly weathered, and apparently deeply offensive to the HOA president, Vanessa Cole. Vanessa arrogantly claimed it looked unfinished from her brand-new infinity pool terrace, demanding it be ripped out and replaced with delicate landscaping that matched Ridgecrest's natural luxury design standards. There was just one immediate problem. I was not inside the HOA. My lower acreage simply bordered it, with Ridgecrest's upper terrace and pool sitting precariously above my property line. But still, the association claimed that an old landscape maintenance easement gave them limited legal rights over a narrow visual corridor. Their attorney aggressively argued that the wall interfered with required aesthetic treatment, while my attorney fiercely disagreed, dragging the exhausting dispute on for months. Then, I decided to hire a licensed geotechnical engineer named Dr. Michael Reeves, who came out to meticulously inspect the wall, the slope, the pool terrace above, and the county's old development plans. His professional conclusion was careful. He did not blindly claim the wall was literally holding up the swimming pool, but he did explicitly state that the heavy stone mass provided essential tow restraint and localized confinement at the base of a slope that had later been massively loaded by Ridgecrest's concrete terrace improvements. His report was crystal clear. Removing it without replacing that support could drastically increase the risk of shallow earth movement, especially during periods of prolonged rainfall. I sent the engineering report straight to the HOA, but Vanessa completely dismissed it as a desperate attempt to avoid compliance, blindly pushing the case straight into legal mediation. Eventually, I agreed to remove the visible wall section, because fighting them all the way to trial would have cost infinitely more than the stone itself. But before the work even started, Michael sent one final, highly documented written warning. He wrote, "Do not remove the retaining mass without an engineered replacement if the upper slope remains loaded." The HOA received the warning, completely ignored it, and still insisted on the demolition. So I removed exactly what the legal settlement required, no more, and certainly no less. I methodically documented every single stone and left the fragile slope as undisturbed as structurally possible. And then, the rain started. It was just 5 wet days. Not a hurricane, not a biblical flood, but just enough running water to reveal exactly what that ugly pile of stone had quietly been doing for decades. The first crack appeared at the pool deck, followed quickly by the concrete coping separating, and then a heavy retaining edge, actively moving toward the valley. And by the time Ridgecrest's panic-stricken insurer finally opened the liability file, the board made a horrifying discovery, a single line buried deep in their own original construction documents that read, "Existing stone retaining mass, maintain or replace with engineered equivalent before upper terrace loading. Vanessa had spent months aggressively trying to erase an ugly wall, completely ignoring the fact that the original developer had explicitly warned them never to touch it. I bought that property 14 years before their luxury pool was even built, a modest house with a stone chimney, a metal roof, a small apple orchard, and a workshop near the drive. The steepest part of the acreage rose directly behind the house toward the ridge, with the stone wall sitting precisely halfway up that slope to hold back the earth. The previous owner told me it had been repaired several times after heavy winter storms, and I maintained it the exact same way, diligently resetting loose stones, clearing blocked drainage, and keeping deep-rooted vegetation securely on the slope. I never once considered it decorative, because it was simply a structural part of the land. Then, Ridgecrest Heights aggressively expanded uphill, starting with standard residential phases before culminating in what the developer called a resort-level amenity complex, complete with a clubhouse, fitness center, fire terrace, and a massive infinity pool projecting boldly toward the valley. The pool instantly became the signature community feature that real estate listings used constantly, with residents willingly paying massive premium assessments to maintain a beautiful, highly expensive structure built directly on a dangerously steep site. During the initial construction, I had watched crews drill, excavate, install complex retaining systems, and bring in massive amounts of heavy earth fill. And at one point, a project engineer even walked my side of the boundary to ask about the old stone wall, photographing it in a moment that seemed entirely insignificant then, but would become legally devastating later. When Vanessa became HOA president 3 years later, she launched a ruthless, power-hungry campaign to improve what she called the lower visual corridor, demanding wild vines be removed, old fencing replaced, native grass installed, until her manic focus finally locked entirely onto my stone wall. Her first letter aggressively asked me to pressure wash it, which I completely ignored after my attorney confirmed the HOA had absolutely no general maintenance authority over my private parcel. Her second letter asked me to replace the loose sections, which I actually did because it made structural sense. But then, Vanessa crossed the line and demanded full demolition. She claimed the rugged wall looked inconsistent with the modern architectural character of the pool terrace, and the HOA arrogantly offered to plant cheap ornamental grasses in its place. That was when I became genuinely concerned, because removing a heavy retaining feature from a steep slope without understanding the underlying soil mechanics seemed completely reckless. I immediately called Michael Reeves, who spent most of a day on site, meticulously analyzing drainage patterns, soil exposure, slope angles, pool elevation, and the existing retaining structures. After reviewing the archived development records from the county, his final report came back, echoing one highly critical phrase: changed support condition. That was the fundamental physics concept Vanessa absolutely refused to understand. The wall did not have to be structurally attached to the pool to fundamentally matter. If the massive upper development had been designed while that lower slope condition existed, removing the lower weight could completely change how the fragile hillside behaved. If you own older property beside a hillside development, keep every single survey, grading plan, drainage drawing, retaining wall record, and engineering report you can possibly find. Because something that looks like an ugly pile of stone may still be doing a massive job that nobody notices until it disappears. And if you have ever watched an arrogant HOA treat basic engineering like an aesthetic argument, leave your thoughts down in the comments and share this story with someone living on a slope, because gravity absolutely does not care how expensive your new landscaping looks. I wanted just one thing: a proper geotechnical review before anyone touched that wall. But Vanessa wanted it gone before the HOA's summer pool season. a purely cosmetic deadline that became far more important to her than a licensed engineer's desperate warning. The legal dispute escalated incredibly quickly, with Ridgecrest claiming a limited easement dating back to the developer phase gave the association rights to forcefully maintain vegetation and visual conditions near the boundary. My attorney, Rachel Bennett, successfully argued that the legal language did not authorize the demolition of a structural retaining feature, but the HOA fiercely disagreed, escalating polite letters into legal notices and legal notices into forced mediation. Vanessa consistently framed the wall as a mere nuisance condition that interfered with the appearance of one of the community's most valuable amenities. But Rachel kept returning to one devastatingly simple question. If the wall comes out, what exactly replaces its retaining function? The HOA's landscape consultant had absolutely no answer, primarily because he was just a landscaper, not a structural geotechnical engineer. Michael offered three clear, highly safe alternatives. Leave the wall entirely alone, remove only the upper visible stones while preserving the buried structural mass, or replace it with a fully engineered retaining system before conducting a full removal. Ridgecrest blindly rejected all three options, arrogantly claiming the wall was not technically part of their pool structure, and therefore not their financial responsibility. A technicality that sounded completely reasonable on paper, but completely ignored the terrifying reality that a mountain slope does not organize itself by arbitrary property lines. Rachel urged me to keep fighting them in court, but I was exhausted, and the legal costs were rapidly climbing into dangerous territory. The final settlement proposal narrowed the removal zone and legally required the HOA to permanently waive several unrelated landscape claims, which I agreed to on one absolute, non-negotiable condition. Michael's formal engineering warning had to be permanently attached to the settlement correspondence, heavily documenting their assumed risk. The removal contractor finally started in early April, and because I wisely hired him myself, I ensured the HOA could not just send a reckless, low-bid demolition crew onto my land. The heavy stones came out methodically and slowly, with absolutely no excavators ripping into the fragile slope, no deep digging, no stump removal, and no aggressive grading. We removed only the exact exposed mass, legally required by the agreement, allowing Michael to photograph the newly exposed slope afterward, where he heavily recommended temporary drainage protection and immediate, daily visual monitoring. I followed his advice to the letter. For the first week, absolutely nothing happened. Vanessa even sent a smug, self-congratulatory community email, celebrating the completion of the lower landscape correction, as the luxury pool deck officially opened for fully catered spring events. Then, the inevitable rain settled over the mountains. Day 1 was incredibly light, Day 2 was slightly heavier, and by Day 4, the deeply exposed soil directly behind the former wall was completely and entirely saturated. I was walking the property when I noticed a shallow tension crack, violently ripping through my upper pasture. It was small, maybe just an inch wide, so I photographed it immediately and sent it straight to Michael. He arrived that exact same afternoon, stared uphill toward the towering pool terrace, and bluntly asked whether Ridgecrest had bothered to install any replacement support, and the terrifying answer was no. He told me to formally notify the HOA immediately, prompting Rachel to send an urgent legal letter demanding the association inspect the pool terrace and lower slope right away due to highly visible post-removal earth movement. Vanessa dismissively replied that surface cracking on my private property did not establish any danger to HOA facilities. But exactly 12 hours later, their pristine concrete infinity pool deck cracked wide open, and their own emergency engineer was finally called screaming to the scene. Ridgecrest was forcefully shut down, and the pool was closed before noon, which was the single correct decision that corrupt board had made in months. The county building department quickly dispatched an inspector, while the HOA's terrified insurer scrambled to hire a highly expensive forensic structural engineer, and a completely separate geotechnical firm was immediately retained to examine the failing slope. I stayed completely off their property because I didn't need to walk around the pool. Michael already had perfectly time-stamped baseline photographs from below. Rachel immediately fired off legal preservation notices, completely locking down every single document relating to the original pool design, the slope stabilization, the retaining systems, the drainage, my stone wall, the HOA's relentless enforcement campaign, the forced settlement, and the recent rainfall event. The first technical finding from the structural experts came shockingly fast. The heavy pool shell itself had not suddenly failed everywhere, but rather, the most severe, catastrophic damage was concentrated entirely at the outer terrace and the lower support zone facing my property. There was active ground settlement, heavy separation at the expansion joints, severe jagged cracking across the concrete deck, and highly localized displacement, moving dangerously along the lower retaining edge. The pool water was frantically lowered to reduce the massive hydrostatic loading, while the panicked engineers desperately investigated the sliding earth. Then, the archived county records finally arrived, and Michael happily dug up the original geotechnical report, revealing that the developer's engineer had explicitly mapped the lower slope as a highly sensitive area, requiring special structural attention during the terrace design. But the absolute smoking gun was a critical construction note from the original pool phase that referenced my old stone feature directly, stating in bold capital letters, "Existing stone retaining mass, maintain or replace with engineered equivalent before upper terrace loading." There was absolutely no legal ambiguity left. Someone had noticed the wall, deeply understood that removing it could trigger a catastrophic failure, and purposefully built the terrace, relying heavily on that existing mass, leaving Ridgecrest to smoothly inherit the perfectly balanced amenity. And yet years later, their arrogant board forced the retaining mass out, without installing a single, solitary piece of engineered replacement support. While that note was incredibly damning, we still legally had to prove the wall removal alone caused the failure. Because in geotechnical engineering, the rain mattered, the soil conditions mattered, the construction details mattered, and the subsurface drainage heavily mattered. The forensic team meticulously reviewed every single variable, finding that the rainfall data showed several inches over 5 days, a highly significant amount of water, but absolutely not an extraordinary weather event for the region. Live laser monitoring found continuous shallow movement in the lower slope, perfectly and mathematically aligned with the exact localized area where the soil confinement had been ripped out. Then, the exhausted engineers found a second, fatal weakness. One specific section of the drainage system, directly behind the pool terrace, was not performing as the original design intended, causing heavy subsurface water to concentrate much more aggressively than anyone expected. That meant the highly fragile hillside was suddenly fighting two catastrophic physics problems at the exact same time: massive water saturation pushing down from above, and completely removed physical restraint holding it up from below. The HOA desperately wanted one simple, convenient explanation to legally blame the bad weather, but the unforgiving engineering physics gave them a highly complex interaction instead. The storm triggered the initial earth movement, the hidden drainage weakness drastically increased the soil saturation, and the forced removal of my lower retaining mass permanently destroyed the Earth's natural structural resistance in that exact same failure zone. And most devastatingly, the board had been formally, legally warned about one of those critical factors before a single stone ever came out of the dirt. But the final crushing blow came when Rachel legally subpoenaed the internal HOA emails, exposing that board member Peter Lang had actually forwarded Michael's warning report directly to Vanessa before the settlement was ever signed, explicitly asking whether Ridgecrest should hire its own geotechnical engineer before blindly insisting on the full removal. Vanessa's documented time-stamped response was incredibly cold and entirely dismissive, arrogantly stating that the wall was outside HOA property and should absolutely not become an excuse to delay her precious visual compliance goals. That single horrific email changed the entire trajectory of the liability case, proving in black and white that the board had been handed the exact, perfect opportunity to properly investigate the engineering risk, and deliberately, arrogantly, chose to ignore it. The independent geotechnical report took 3 agonizing weeks to finalize, and its beautifully dry, highly undramatic tone is exactly what made it so legally devastating. The firm's engineers did not wildly claim my small stone wall was holding up the entire multi-million-dollar infinity pool like a magical shelf. Instead, they definitively concluded that the historic retaining mass had simply contributed vital, localized tow restraint along the lower slope. Its sudden removal drastically changed the support condition, and when directly combined with the prolonged rainfall and the hidden drainage concentration, that forced change materially and directly contributed to the slope's catastrophic movement. The absolute conclusion was entirely non-negotiable. The massive upper terrace required incredibly deep, highly engineered stabilization before that pool could ever safely reopen to the public. Ridgecrest's insurance company immediately panicked and forcefully focused on the legal process, demanding to know exactly what the board knew, exactly when they knew it, and exactly what engineering review had been completed before demanding the demolition. The answers were an absolute liability nightmare. Michael had formally warned them, Peter had desperately requested an independent review, and the original, stamped construction documents contained a direct, undeniable instruction to maintain or immediately replace the wall's structural function. Yet the corrupt board had evaluated absolutely none of those glaring red flags before aggressively pushing the legal settlement. In a desperate, pathetic final move, the HOA tried to legally argue that I had removed the stones improperly, a blatant lie that failed instantly because my contractor's time-stamped photos showed perfectly controlled removal. Michael had personally supervised the delicate work. The settlement drawings flawlessly matched the execution, and absolutely no unauthorized excavation had ever occurred. The legal problem was never how I removed the wall. The catastrophic problem was that they had relentlessly demanded its complete removal without ever paying for an engineered replacement plan. Then, the jaw-dropping damage estimates finally arrived on the board's desk, revealing that the pool deck needed massive partial reconstruction. The outer retaining system required deep anchoring stabilization. The drainage had to be completely ripped out and redesigned, and the highly compromised slope desperately needed heavy steel support, alongside a brand new, fully engineered retaining solution, built much lower down on the hillside. The combined project cost instantly skyrocketed, deep into the 6 figures, heavily draining the community's emergency reserves. Because the luxury pool stayed completely closed through most of the sweltering summer, the political damage to the Ridgecrest board hurt almost as much as the financial devastation, as their highly prized infinity pool, the exact amenity homeowners proudly showed off to their guests, now sat rotting behind ugly chain-link fencing, covered in red county inspection tags and messy temporary drains. Vanessa desperately tried to legally reopen just one small, unaffected section early to save face with the angry neighborhood, but the county sternly refused to allow any public access until a highly licensed structural engineer fully signed off on the safety. That was the incredibly satisfying moment when all operational authority permanently shifted completely away from the arrogant board, meaning no more petty aesthetic arguments, and absolutely no more unhinged emails about visual standards, because the county only cared about mathematical calculations, the massive insurer only cared about liability documentation, and the terrified engineers only cared about finding solid, stable ground. And as Vanessa ultimately learned the hardest way possible, the ground simply did not care who was the HOA president. The Ridgecrest board meeting in July was standing room only, absolutely packed with furious, screaming homeowners who had been paying massive premium monthly assessments for a luxury pool they couldn't even safely walk near, and they demanded immediate, highly specific answers. Peter Lang solemnly stood up and presented the horrific timeline to the crowd. My very first legal objection: Michael's entirely ignored engineering report, his formal replacement recommendation, Peter's own aggressively denied request for an independent review, Vanessa's arrogant rejection, the forced settlement, the wall removal, the heavy rain, the slope cracking, and finally, the catastrophic pool damage. Then, in a move of pure, brutal transparency, he displayed the old developer note boldly on a massive projector screen for everyone in the room to read. Maintain or replace with engineered equivalent. The entire room went dead quiet before one furious homeowner sharply asked whether Ridgecrest had replaced it, to which the answer was a humiliating no. And another asked whether the board had even bothered to hire a geotechnical engineer before forcing the removal, to which the answer was also no, prompting a third, highly agitated resident to furiously scream at the board, demanding to know why not. Vanessa nervously stuttered into the microphone that the wall was on private property, weakly claiming the HOA had reasonably relied on the blind belief that its pool was independently engineered. While that was partly legally true, since the massive pool did have to mathematically stand on its own, the developer note proved undeniably that the original design team had still heavily recognized and relied upon the lower slope's delicate physical condition to maintain earth stability. Then, the insurer's expensive consultant bluntly explained the terrifying legal difference to the angry crowd. The wall was not part of the pool structure, it was a critical part of the overall site condition, and drastically changing site conditions without a proper engineering review fundamentally and dangerously changes the liability risk. That single, devastating sentence instantly ended the entire debate, heavily forcing the newly humbled board to approve a massive, six-figure stabilization plan where a highly engineered retaining system would be installed exclusively on the HOA side, where practical, paired with a strictly limited legal construction agreement for the delicate work near my property boundary. The poor drainage behind the terrace would be completely ripped out and heavily improved. The severely cracked deck section would be entirely demolished and rebuilt, and the repaired pool shell would be strictly monitored by highly sensitive lasers for weeks before ever allowing a single drop of water inside. Meanwhile, Rachel flawlessly negotiated a completely separate, ironclad resolution exclusively for me, legally forcing the HOA to completely withdraw every single remaining landscape claim related to the wall, and legally binding them to fully reimburse 100% of my professional engineering and legal costs tied to the entire forced removal dispute. We also successfully mandated that any future work affecting the shared slope legally required a comprehensive, independent geotechnical review before either side could ever alter major retaining features again. Sweeping governance reforms quickly swept through the community, permanently stripping the corrupt board of the dangerous power to demand the removal of a retaining wall, an earth berm, a drainage structure, or a vital slope vegetation system near shared terrain without a highly qualified technical review backing it up. Strict conflict of interest disclosures were also legally required whenever a board officer personally benefited from a view-related enforcement decision, a newly forged rule that deeply mattered because Vanessa's own personal home looked directly across the pool terrace toward the exact area where my stone wall had previously blocked her precious valley view. Furious residents finally started putting the horrific pieces together, loudly and publicly asking whether basic earth engineering had been dangerously overridden by petty neighborhood aesthetics, simply because the valley view personally mattered to a few corrupt board members in power. A massive, community-wide recall petition immediately began circulating from door to door, heavily forcing Vanessa to resign in absolute disgrace as president right before the humiliating vote could legally take place, allowing Peter to step up and take over temporarily. His very first phone call to me wasn't to arrogantly complain about the visual appearance of the slope, but rather to politely ask exactly when Michael could meet the HOA's geotechnical consultant on site, which was the single most useful question anyone from Ridgecrest had bothered to ask in months. The newly built retaining system looked absolutely nothing like the old rugged wall, fully replacing the simple fieldstone with heavy steel anchors, highly engineered concrete, massive amounts of expensive drainage aggregate, deep subsurface collection lines, and heavily reinforced slope zones. It was incredibly modern, pristine, astronomically expensive, and completely, absolutely invisible to the naked eye once the final native landscaping was returned to the soil. The infinity pool finally reopened in early fall after nervous engineers methodically refilled it in slow, highly careful stages, fully ensuring the laser monitoring points showed perfectly stable earth movement before the beautifully rebuilt concrete deck finally passed its strict county inspection, allowing the pristine infinity edge to once again beautifully reflect the Carolina mountains. From a distance, most new residents couldn't even tell that a massive catastrophic failure had ever happened. And that was the ultimate, highly expensive irony of the entire disaster. Ridgecrest had spent months ruthlessly fighting an old stone wall simply because it looked a little too rugged for their luxury tastes. But after literally spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency stabilization repairs, the final highly engineered solution was something absolutely nobody could even see. I eventually rebuilt a much smaller, purely decorative stone feature, strictly on my side of the property line, absolutely not retaining the pool, and fiercely not carrying a single ounce of slope load, but just simple landscape stone, placed in a location that Michael meticulously and legally approved before I ever dropped a single rock into the dirt. So, if you ever own property on a highly steep hill, especially beside older retaining walls, luxury pools, massive concrete terraces, heavy roads, or brand new neighboring developments, absolutely do not let anyone forcefully bully you into removing structural features just because some bored HOA board member calls them ugly. Get highly qualified geotechnical engineering advice first. Save the heavily documented written report, tightly protect the official county survey, and fiercely archive every single time-stamped email proving exactly who was warned and exactly when they arrogantly chose to ignore it. If this catastrophic story made you think a little differently about the highly dangerous battle between arrogant HOA aesthetics and actual gravitational engineering, leave your opinion down in the comments. Would you have cautiously accepted the legal settlement and removed the wall while holding the warnings, or would you have fiercely fought them in civil court until the board was legally forced to build a highly engineered replacement first? Share this story with someone who owns property on a precarious slope. Heavily save the video if you thoroughly enjoy HOA disputes where hard scientific evidence and strict engineering matter infinitely more than neighborhood arrogance. And be sure to subscribe for more stories where the ultimate legal reversal always comes from simply stepping back and letting the paper records ruthlessly speak for themselves. I still stand near the lower slope sometimes and quietly look uphill at that incredibly expensive pool, freely admitting that it truly is a beautiful structure, and actively remembering that I never actually wanted it damaged, and I certainly never wanted anyone to get hurt. I simply wanted my ugly little wall left completely alone until someone technically competent could truthfully answer one single question: what is this rock actually doing? Vanessa never once bothered to ask that highly critical question, completely choosing instead to only aggressively ask, whether it looked good for the glossy real estate photos. But the original, highly cautious developer had asked that exact engineering question many years earlier, which is precisely why that heavily buried warning existed in the first place. Maintain or replace. A devastatingly simple four-word legal instruction that could have easily prevented absolutely everything. My old wall had never been glamorous. Absolutely nobody ever took glowing pictures in front of it. Nobody ever put it in a glossy sales brochure, and it certainly did not increase property values because it was visually attractive to wealthy buyers. It only had immense structural value because it quietly and tirelessly resisted the massive gravitational weight of the entire hillside. The exact kind of silent, incredibly vital structural value that is incredibly easy for an arrogant board to ignore, right up until the very terrifying second it is gone. Ridgecrest genuinely thought they were just forcefully removing a minor aesthetic problem from their pristine view, but the very next rainstorm, violently and expensively, showed them they had permanently changed a highly delicate engineering condition. And by the time their multi-million-dollar infinity pool cracked wide open and threatened to slide completely down the mountain, the absolute ugliest thing on that hillside was no longer my old fieldstone wall. It was the devastating, six-figure financial price of arrogantly pretending it had never mattered.